Have you ever noticed how the biggest changes in history don't start with explosions or breaking news, but with a quiet little shift no one's paying attention to? Well, something like that is happening right now. And it's not in Washington, it's in Ottawa. At first glance, it looks harmless. A few handshakes with leaders from faraway places. Some polite speeches about friendship and shared values.
But look closer, and you'll see the outline of a plan. A plan that could change where Canada's future really lies. And maybe, just maybe, loosen the grip of its oldest and closest partner, the United States. It's called CANZUK, and if you've never heard of it, you're about to. Because this isn't just another trade deal. This is a move that could redraw Canada's alliances, reshape its economy, and rewire the way it connects to the world. What is CANZUK really? At its core, CANZUK is the idea of building a formal alliance between four countries: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Countries that share more than just a language. They share legal systems rooted in British common law, similar parliamentary democracies, and cultural traditions stretching back centuries. The plan goes beyond economics. It envisions a union where citizens can freely live and work in any of the member nations without restrictive visas. It calls for the elimination of tariffs and trade barriers. And it proposes deeper military and intelligence cooperation, effectively linking these nations' defense strategies. In other words, it's part free trade agreement, part travel union, and part defense pact. Why the sudden push? Here's where the timing gets interesting. For decades, CANZUK was little more than a political fantasy tossed around by a handful of think tanks. But in recent years, several geopolitical shifts have given it new life. Canada, U.S. relations have grown more complicated, from disputes over softwood lumber and dairy quotas to high-profile clashes over energy pipelines like Keystone XL. The United States has also pushed Canada to spend more on defense, sometimes with public criticism that rattled Ottawa's confidence in the partnership. Meanwhile, the UK's decision to leave the European Union, Brexit, left Britain looking for new global trade partners who share its values and systems. Australia and New Zealand, both strong economies in the Asia-Pacific, have been increasingly cautious about over-relying on China as their primary trade partner, especially with rising tensions in the region. All of a sudden, the four countries had overlapping motivations to look toward each other. The economic potential. On paper, CANZUK would form a combined market of over 135 million people with a GDP exceeding $6 trillion. Each member brings unique strengths: Canada's vast natural resources and energy sector, the UK's global financial hub in London, Australia's booming mining and agricultural industries, New Zealand's advanced agriculture and technology exports. Free movement of labor would allow skills to flow where they're most needed. Imagine Canadian engineers working on Australian infrastructure projects, or British doctors filling shortages in Canadian hospitals. Businesses could expand across borders with fewer bureaucratic hurdles. For Canada, diversifying trade away from heavy U.S. dependence could provide stability during economic shocks, something painfully learned during past U.S.-imposed tariffs. The U.S. factor. But here's the elephant in the room. The United States is Canada's single largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 75% of all exports. The two countries are not just economic allies. They share the world's longest undefended border, integrated supply chains, and critical defense arrangements through NORAD. If Washington sees CANZUK as a move to reduce Canada's reliance on the U.S., it might react, not necessarily with hostility, but with strategic pressure. This could mean slower negotiations on future trade agreements, more rigid border policies, or reduced cooperation on certain defense matters. In other words, Canada would have to balance its CANZUK ambitions carefully, ensuring it adds partners without alienating its neighbor. Military and security cooperation. A CANZUK defense agreement could be a game changer. All four nations are already part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, along with the U.S., meaning they already share high-level intelligence. But closer integration could mean joint military bases, coordinated naval operations, and streamlined defense manufacturing between members. For Canada, this could open up more security cooperation in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, potentially making it less dependent on U.S.-led missions. Public opinion and political hurdles. Surprisingly, polls in Canada have shown strong public support for CANZUK. It's not just a political talking point. It's an idea that resonates with people across the country. The biggest draw? Free movement of people. Canadians could work, live, or study in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand without visas or long immigration waits. Younger Canadians see it as a chance to explore, build global careers, and gain experiences that current rules make difficult. For them, it's a doorway to the world. But critics warn of risks. Shifting focus toward distant allies could pull attention from urgent domestic issues like housing, healthcare, and Indigenous reconciliation. There's also concern about Canada's most important partner, the United States. Some fear CANZUK might be seen in Washington as a move away from North American priorities. Skeptics argue that without U.S. economic power, CANZUK could struggle to match the influence of giants like the European Union or USMCA. Supporters counter that it's not just about size. Shared history, values, and strategic trust could make CANZUK a strong global player. For now, the debate remains open. Will CANZUK be Canada's bold step into a new future, or a costly distraction from the alliances it already depends on? Political will is also key. While discussions are active, moving from talks to treaties is a complex process that could take years. What happens next? So where are we now? Canadian officials have already engaged in preliminary talks with UK and Australian leaders on aligning immigration systems and harmonizing certain trade rules. There's growing support in all four countries' parliaments, and think tanks are pushing detailed proposals into the political mainstream. The next step would likely be a formal feasibility study, followed by pilot agreements, perhaps starting with youth mobility visas or specific trade sectors, before a full CANZUK treaty. The big question: is this simply Canada expanding its network of allies while staying loyal to the US? Or is it the early stage of a major pivot, one that could rewire the country's economic and strategic future? Because if CANZUK becomes reality, it won't just be a dry, technical treaty signed behind closed doors. It will be a symbol, a powerful declaration to the world that Canada's destiny isn't locked solely to the United States, nor confined by its geographic borders. It will send the message that Canada's future could stretch far beyond the familiar ties of North America, across vast oceans, into the embrace of nations that share not only a common language, but a deep historical bond and a set of political values forged over centuries. This wouldn't just be about trade agreements, immigration policies, or defense cooperation. It would be about reuniting four countries: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, whose roots trace back to the same imperial history, yet whose modern ambitions align in surprising ways. It would mean opening new doors for economic growth, scientific collaboration, and cultural exchange on a scale that could rival the influence of even the largest global blocs. And if that happens, it could mark the beginning of a geopolitical realignment, one where Canada, often viewed as a quiet middle power, suddenly finds itself at the very center of a network that stretches across the Atlantic and Pacific. Imagine the strategic advantage: the combined economic weight of four advanced economies, military coordination spanning multiple hemispheres, and a shared democratic identity that could stand as a counterbalance to rising authoritarian powers. This isn't just theory. In a world where alliances are shifting faster than ever, a successful CANZUK could change how Canada is perceived, not as a side player in America's shadow, but as a key architect of a new global order. It would be a pivot from being defined by proximity to the US to being defined by leadership in a worldwide partnership. So stay tuned, because what appears to be a polite, diplomatic conversation today, a few carefully worded statements, a handful of closed-door meetings, could, in hindsight, turn out to be the geopolitical surprise of the decade. The kind of move that catches even the most seasoned analysts off guard and forces the rest of the world to rethink where power truly lies. Disclaimer: the following content is based on publicly available information, expert opinions, and ongoing political discussions. The concepts and scenarios discussed, including the potential formation of CANZUK, are speculative and not officially confirmed. Viewers should treat this as informational and not as political, legal, or financial advice.